Welcome to Canadian Justice. I'm Christine Van Gyn, and today we're discussing the laws of war, humanitarian law, and how these principles apply in the context of the current Israel-Hamas war. War is always monstrous, and in order to rein in some of the horrors of war, international legal doctrines have been developed to apply to armed conflicts and humanitarian crises. On October 7th, there was a brutal and appalling terrorist attack by Hamas against Israeli civilians that targeted children, babies, mothers, grandparents, the disabled. There are innocent people who have been taken into Gaza as hostages, and Gaza is now being bombed by Israel in response. Israel has told civilians to move to the south of Gaza as it prepares for a ground invasion to wipe out the terrorist group Hamas. The southern border of Gaza into Egypt has slowly been allowing in some amount of aid for civilians, food, water, and medicine, but the pace has been slow. How does international law apply to this situation? Here to discuss this are two experts. Brian Lee Cox is a professor at Cornell Law School, specialized in the law of armed conflict, and Sarah Teich is a lawyer and senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Thank you both so much for joining me today. Brian, I want to start with a question about what laws even apply, because this is not a conflict between two sort of independent states, the way we might characterize the war between Russia and Ukraine. Gaza is not a separate state, although obviously there's a lot of political and legal analysis about that issue itself. I think how we characterize this conflict has a really big impact on actually what international laws apply here.
Absolutely. So there are a whole host of countries that do recognize the Palestine as a state, as the state of Palestine, but its actual its recognition as a matter of international law is subject to debate. But even if one considers Palestine to be kind of a full-fledged state, the current fight that Israel is engaged in isn't against Palestine in general; it's against Hamas. And so, when Israel or when a country, when a state is fighting against a non-state armed group, a smaller selection of international law, the law of armed conflict, applies. And so, for example, if Israel were to go to war with, a fully fledged recognized state, like say, for example, the Russia and the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, all of the law of armed conflict applies, including all of the Geneva Conventions of 1949. All four of those apply. Whereas when a state is fighting against an organized armed group, it's a smaller collection of law of armed conflict that applies.
Now, I think one of the core principles around laws of armed conflict and wars deals with civilians and how civilians are treated in war. What can you tell us about, Sarah, how laws about protection for civilians apply to the Israeli government, to the Israeli Defense Force, and how laws regarding the treatment of civilians applies to Hamas?
Great question. I would defer to Brian on the different applications between state and non-state actors, but sort of in general, Israel cannot deliberately target civilians. And what we've seen is that, according to reports, is that they haven't. I mean, they've ordered the civilians to leave the areas that they're planning on bombing. And we've seen evidence that Hamas is the group that is preventing much of those exits. And Israel actually released satellite footage of physical blockades that Hamas put on the roads to prevent them from leaving. So we're seeing quite a high civilian death toll, which is absolutely tragic, but I don't see any evidence that Israel has been deliberately targeting civilians in the way that would be prohibited by law.
And Sarah, to follow up on that, I think that obviously every civilian death is terrible and tragic, but there seems to be a real emphasis here on the conduct of Israel in their response has resulted in civilian deaths, and that there's absolutely no doubt about that. But there are people who are quite vocal about this consequence, this terrible consequence, but they seem to have been ignoring the fact that Hamas intentionally targeted Israeli civilians. What's your view on that? Do you think that's hypocritical? We've got about 30 seconds.
Yes, it's very hypocritical, and it's a misplacing of blame. It's victim blaming at its finest. It ignores the fact that Hamas has committed war crimes against Israeli civilians, and I think it's abhorrent, frankly. And we see a lot of international legal language be quite weaponized in this regard.
Brian, anything to add on that in about 15 seconds?
Really, just the emphasis, like Sarah said, is the focus on intent, right? And so we have to know the
Mhm.
intent of those who are engaged
Yeah,
in targeting operations to
yeah.
tell whether it's a war crime or not.
We've got to go to commercial, but we'll be right back.